Hello, everyone, and good evening from Mountain View, California. This is UX Quests, and we are in a special live stream today with a few of my esteemed colleagues and peers who were both participants and speakers at UXRConf Anywhere 2020, an incredible conference which just ended on Friday, 2-day fully remote conference with some of the most astoundingly incredible speakers, activities, events, people. It was the largest user research conference, I believe, in history. People from every single continent, except for Antarctica, participated. I'm pretty sure they're going to send one of us to Antarctica next time just to make sure that that gets resolved. And I am truly honored to be joined by three incredible people today, Matt, Monal, and Sekai, who were all speakers at the conference and participants. And we just wanted to take the time to reflect on the conference and everything that went on and our favorite talks. And we're going to do that right now. So that's really about it. If you have any questions or comments and you're watching this, please send us your questions by simply commenting on YouTube, and we will try to get to them as soon as we can. I can already see the comments starting to come together. Yeah, so we're going to get to everything, or we'll try. And also, if you want to check out more content in the future, please subscribe at youtube.com/thenoamseg. For much more to come in the future, including a second season of UXR Conversations, which I'm very excited about. Some good speakers are going to join for that. But for now, let's focus on UXRConf Anywhere. And I think we have to start with you, Sekai. You had an incredible talk. It was thought-provoking. It was humbling. It was difficult, I think, at times. There's so much to say. I think, the quote that I will take with me, or one of the many quotes I'll take with me, is when you said, "I'm here to call bullshit on empathy in design and research with love."
I'm glad you caught with love.
Yes. And you ended with that message as well, with love to everyone who was watching and who was there. Man, I don't even know where to start, but I will, and I'll give Monal and Matt a chance afterwards. Would you say you are optimistic at this point, or pessimistic about our ability to have empathy, to build good tech products? You mentioned tech as being a scalable way to goodness, and that research can accelerate that. But clearly we have deep issues right now. Do you remain optimistic about our ability to be empathetic? Should we be? I mean, you made it clear that we are all fucking up in a bunch of ways. You literally said that.
That sounds terribly pessimistic. Like, I'll tell you, I am terribly optimistic about what is possible for researchers in particular to deploy empathy. I believe in empathy as a starting proposition. I call bullshit on the extent to which it informs our work in a meaningful way. And one of the things that doesn't come across in the talk is that a lot of my disbelief in empathy is really a reflection and self-awareness about how I was working in the field and what I was doing really, really well, and the methods that I was actually deploying. So, I mean, I work with a lot of, over the course of my career, I've worked with a lot of populations where it was difficult to really get, to feel empathy for their experiences. And I think maybe like 7 years back, I was like, sometimes I don't even try. And I got really curious about what I was doing when I wasn't really trying to experience empathy. And so for the last 7 years, I'd say I was walking around like kind of suspicious because I'm like, if I'm not really doing empathy, I don't know how much it's happening, like just from a starting proposition. So I started talking to my colleagues, I started observing, and and then I'm watching, I'm ascending in my career, I'm in the rooms where decisions are being made, and I'm like, even if I do empathy really, really well, like I have to fight so hard to make the small decision that is good for the user, that I'm like, when it gets to the really big decisions in a lot of organizations, I know not to bother. And so it really started from a place of self-reflection about the work that I was doing. And then as I looked at all of the work that we were doing, I talked to my colleagues, I surveyed them. There was a whole sort of research program that undergirded my conclusion. I didn't get to that because it was less important to talk about that, because I felt like if I just said calling bullshit on empathy, people would hear that, because they think we know, and there's sometimes when we're in our work where empathy is not the thing that is the transformer.
Yeah, I'm it's interesting to hear the optimistic. I still wonder, I can't help but wonder, the second quote that caught my ears, perhaps other people's, is there is no empathy in the capitalist production of technology. So it left me wondering, should we strive to be empathetic, or is this a call for us to strive to improve ourselves as people, the processes, the ecosystems you mentioned, all of these things, in order to build an empathy which truly is, in your words, a lubricant of our product research? Or is that just not in our future because it's not part of the production of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of like, what can we reasonably accomplish in our career? I don't know that pursuing empathy and making us all sort of empathetically fit is the near term goal that researchers should go after. I think that what researchers can look at, I think it actually starts with looking at the environment and being really, really clear about what's possible for you in the decision-making culture and the environments you work in. And I think that is sometimes project by project, team by team, organization by organization. But I think just starting and evaluating whether there's an outlet for empathy, whether there's a trajectory in the organization that allows empathy to be the thing that catalyzes the decision-making, I think start there. And then I think once you realize that the answer is probably no, then what, right? Then get better at your methodology. Right? Get tighter about how you're thinking, how you're getting to patterns, how you're getting to frameworks, how you're getting to decisions when empathy is not a factor, because you can control your process and be thoughtful about your process. And if you feel like it, work on becoming the kind of person that can deploy empathy. But I think researchers can do good work without empathy. And I think we should be honest about that and get curious about what it means to do good work without empathy. But I think we do our best work with empathy. And so I would say, like, start developing the infrastructure organizationally on your teams that might make empathy possible. I think more than anything, I wanted researchers to leave feeling like what they needed was power in the organization, so that for the researchers who actually are good at empathy, and there are many, so that they have an outlet for it, right? So like, where should research be situated on the organizational flow that best allows an empathy-led product development process? So I think there are a number of places where an individual who's heard the talk, where they can start. Of course, you could start with yourself. I think it's harder. I think that is the hardest thing, to become a person who is capable of the sort of empathy that is meaningful for users. I think that is the hardest task. Figuring out where research needs to be to make us less dependent on empathy, I think is more actionable. And I think a lot of the other speakers sort of got into like giving your power away and not giving your power away, and saying what's possible, saying what's not possible. Like, I need time because like I can't develop empathy in like 3 days of fielding. So yeah, I mean, I think that's where I am. That's where I am with it.
Matt and Monal, feel free to shut me up here because it's hard for me to shut up, as you know. But I do have one more question, Sekai. I'd love to ask. We all recorded our talks ahead of time for this conference. And I know I wondered for my own talk, or I had all of these thoughts after I recorded it of other things I wanted to say, and I just didn't. When you reflect on your talk, the one that was recorded, the one that we all saw, was there anything else you wanted to say, reflecting on your talk that you didn't get a chance to and that you'd like to share now, or something you kind of wanted to change but couldn't?
Yeah, I think I would have. I mean, I think, like I said, I wanted to talk more. I think I should have spoken more about how I got to the conclusions I got to. But I think at the end of it all, I want researchers. I think researchers are among the most sort of special category of people who participate in the business world, and I want researchers to have an attraction to power, to be able to identify the locus of power such that they can decide how they want to engage with it. I think you see researchers in organizations often in really disempowered roles, and I imagine a scenario where, in the next 10 years, we'll find the majority of the, like the top technology companies led by researchers or people who spend a significant portion of their career leading research. And so what would be required for research as a discipline to develop the ethic and the skill set and the decision, like just the business view to lead these organizations? Like, I care deeply about that. And I think we should start talking about what it takes for the research to CEO trajectory.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I would love to see that happen. And I agree. I think there are a lot of researchers today who, we grew up in a very individual contributor mindset in terms of like the discipline. And it's only been recently, I'd say, where there have been more and more pure like research managerial positions, which have allowed us to be seen as leaders, not just leaders as individual contributors, but really gain more of that power and influence. But we're still working our way up in the organizational world. So it's interesting because in some ways, and this I think is reflected in your talk to some degree, is at the top there's profiteering, right? Like, it's a business. A business is about making money. And so how do we make that sort of work like with empathy in a good way? And I was curious, like, if any of you, but especially you, Sekai, have thoughts about if we should look at changing the company and the organization first in terms of like what can we do and becoming more powerful. Like, what are some practical examples of what we as researchers or research leaders can do?
I think that's an important. I think that's an important question.
I was just going to say that we have a question here which relates to this. Sorry to interrupt you, Sky. Julie Saunders asks, what if there's no room for empathy in an organization? So, sorry, go ahead, Sekai.
I mean, I think that's the hypothesis, right? Like, I have gotten to a place where I've been from startup to Fortune 1, and it's hard. The business organization as a structure is a problem. And I think what we have to overcome is the business organization. And I think what researchers can do to start pushing against that now is to start fighting to do more business model research. Like, your business model is broken, right? Like, everything is going to be shitty therefrom because your business model is broken. And I don't know if you guys have had the experience of trying to engage leadership in a research program to study the business model so that you can get to a business model that is not toxic or that doesn't rely on selling out your user base down the line. But it's really, really hard. So the closer that we can get to research and where the money is made, the better served that we'll be to sort of make the case that there is a fundamental problem, there's a structural problem with businesses. I no longer believe that like we can make empathetic products in like the traditional way. And so there are things that I'm exploring with that put research outside of the organization? What are the other ways that like highly researched insights can be consumed that aren't dependent on a capitalist business structure? Or like, what are the ways to put like users at the front end of like owning their user experience? I think there are a lot of experimental questions that researchers need to meaningfully engage. And I think we have to like lead that work, because the business isn't going to put themselves out of business, but research can, right? Like we can go figure out what works, and we should.
One reflection I had when I was thinking about your talk, Sekai, which there was a lot to think about, but one thing in particular that stuck out to me was my experience throughout my career working at both for-profit companies and nonprofit companies. And an interesting thing to think about is the fact that I think that instinct for self-preservation even exists if you work at like a nonprofit, an NGO, whatever the case may be. Like it's not always the profit incentive; it's the self-preservation instinct, right? And self-preservation incentive that makes employing and acting on true empathy at the highest levels challenging sometimes, right? Especially if you uncover an insight that's fundamentally at odds with sort of why the organization exists in the first place, right?
I mean, I think that's so true. It's like businesses have this unassailable right to life. Organizations have this unassailable right to life that you don't really see anywhere else. And it's like, why? Like, for what good reason do you need to exist? Like, you can actually go out of business and we'll be fine. And I think even if you think about how people were approaching the decision making around COVID, it's really like, why? Why do these businesses have to persist, right? Like, let them expire. Because there's so many other ways of solving problems. But I think I was curious for you guys, like when I started my talk in the way that Noam reminded us, but like, what was your sort of like immediate response to bullshit on empathy?
Mine was, my immediate thought went to Viviane Castillo, because I think she expressed a really similar sentiment in her talk at this conference last year. So she immediately came to mind, but for me, I've sort of moved beyond empathy as an idea that I talk about in the work environment. And maybe it's partly because of a lot of the things you were talking about, Sekai, and maybe it's a matter of being jaded to a certain degree. But I think whether you call it empathy or not, I mean, I think the root of the big idea you were sharing was what we claim to be great at and what we claim to do as researchers can sometimes just be sort of a moot point, and there are all these like pleasant fictions that we tend to tell ourselves about why we do what we do, right? When really at the end of the day, we're there to help sort of optimize a product and to grease the wheels of the capitalist machine, right? So I thought it was great. I mean, there were other parts of the talk that I thought were so challenging to me in a really healthy way. I loved when you talked about having to build up the muscle for true empathy, right? And that is a journey that's fundamentally different depending on your starting point, whether you're in like the dominant cultural position or not. Which I thought was just like a really great thing to call out and for me to reflect on. But yeah, I'll let Monal or Noam share their thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad to hear you remain optimistic, because one of the things I took from the talk was gratitude and optimism that we can have really meaningful discussions about these things and dive into a concept like empathy and talk about empathetic fitness and empathetic endurance, which you mentioned. I'm glad that we're at that point in our maturity that we can open up these discussions and really unpack what these things mean. That leaves me optimistic, even though we clearly have a very long way to go.
Can I interject real quick? I also wanted to point out, I'm curious if other people saw a lot of connective tissue between Sekai's talk and Molly Stevens' talk.
Absolutely.
Because I think that is a really interesting conversation to have. I think it's like, it's all one, they're different parts of the same conversation, right? It's like, if we really want to enact change, if we really want to be agents of change in our organizations, like, there are a lot of things we have to start doing differently. There are a lot of things we have to do differently about how we do our job, and we have to be positioned differently within the organization, and that takes work and that takes intention, right? And immediately when I was hearing Molly speak, I was thinking about a lot of these things. I'm curious if I was the only one.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly, like, Molly got into the tactics of it all, which is like, and for me, it reminded me, like, like, there's this other part of it, which is like, if we're going to be like, if we're the function that allows the business to say, like, yes, we checked with our users, this is great for our users. Like, if that's, like, we have our demands too. Like, this is what we demand for you to check that box. And I think Molly's talk got me thinking about what those demands look like if they were to be heard, right? What are the things that we can do for our discipline internally right now, from a leadership perspective, that can get us closer to the dignity I think that our craft deserves.
Yeah, I feel like the conference organizers intentionally put those two talks back to back as a 1-2 punch. It's like, all right, and I think I saw some comments saying, like, whoa, I need to take a break now. Like, that was a lot, but like in a good way, like, wow, I'm so inspired. I feel so empowered, and I need to, like, just sit and, like, think about this now.
While we were talking, we have a shout out from Alec, who together with Maggie lead the UXR collective, organizer of the conference. He's inviting each of us, if we want to do a follow-up talk anytime. So maybe we'll take you up on that, Alec. Thank you so much for everything you do, to you and to Maggie and the entire UXR team, and to all of the sponsors as well. I see Sophia Quintero was in the house, founder and CEO of Enjoy HQ. By the way, Sophia, I'm going to go on record here. You had the coolest ads.
Totally.
The best ads for any sponsor. So very impressed with that. And check out Enjoy HQ for your knowledge management needs. So let's talk about, shall we move on to another talk perhaps? Matt, do you want to embarrass me like we like to do sometimes? Should we talk about, or maybe we can avoid that this time and talk about someone else? Monal, who do you want to talk about?
Oh, there's, I think we could put you on the spot, Noam. Yeah, why not? Okay. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Well,
yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think in the same way that I saw connective tissue between Sekai's talk and Molly's talk, I also saw connective tissue between Behzad's talk and Noam's talk. Just in sort of the idea of how to phrase this, opening the gates and inviting more people into the discipline, or in Behzad's case, really sort of trying to harness the power of the broader organization to do more research. Noam, your message was more just sort of letting people know that there's space for them in this field, which is so awesome to do and to signal and to put out there. But yeah, I thought it was great. But it's a topic that I know, at least in my experience, people love to debate this one internally in research teams. Like, can anyone do this? Can anyone do this job? I mean, if given the right time and training and support, do we feel comfortable saying that? Is that devaluing ourselves a little bit? So I'm curious, Noam, how you would answer that question if somebody asked.
Yeah, so on this very YouTube channel, my most recent video, other than this, was about how there is no research generalist. And that particular video ties very closely into many of Molly's messages around expertise. I'm a believer in expertise. I believe that we should strive to be experts. I believe expertise matters. And I believe that, to Sekai's point and many others in the conference, there are grave dangers almost, I would say, given our responsibilities, if we don't develop that expertise and take our roles very, very seriously. So I absolutely believe in that. At the same time, and I learned this from my psychology background and other things, people are very multifaceted. We are multifaceted, complex beings. And we need people to join. We need, I call it in the video, a mix of methodical researchers to join from all different backgrounds to help us unpack the complex creatures that people are. We need that. And so it's not so much that anyone can be a researcher. I don't really believe in that. But I do believe that there are so many potential backgrounds you can come from that will, give you incredible superpowers, incredible skills that will make you a wonderful researcher. And that often those things are unexpected. So in Bezod's case, his ability to communicate research so beautifully comes, in my opinion, from his photography background. Oh. In my opinion, Claire Menke's ability to think at a level of complexity that few people can, in my opinion, comes partially from her studying this very niche topic of Earth systems that I'm not even sure exists in many universities. And in that degree, you think in very complex frameworks. So I can go on and on. I can go through this exercise for you right now. It wouldn't even be too hard for me because I can see it. But you can only see it once you reflect on your career or other people's careers years later. And so I just want people to know, people who are out there is no clear benchmark. And we have to stop thinking about, constantly thinking about the next tool, the next conference, the next thing. It's not there. It's not there. It's an illusion. And I went on my journey and I wanted to share it with others because, again, people kept asking me, what's a psychologist doing in tech? And it turns out there were some pretty important psychologists who, helped planes not crash, and they helped invent the telephone, and they helped do things which are pretty important, helpful to the world, all in all. And so I'm proud to be a psychologist, and I'm proud to add a little bit of special sauce into this profession. We all can. And that's my opinion on that, basically.
I think that's an interesting question. I think a little different. Like I think I'm probably on record somewhere as saying that anyone can be a researcher. And I think for the most part, if there is, Noam, you talk about this idea of intellectual humility. Like if there is some earnest intellectual humility, I think anybody can be taught in 40 hours how to go from observation to insight to opportunity. I think that. I think that there are all of the skill sets that we don't talk about enough as researchers, that I think a lot of our, like, as an anthropologist, you as a psychologist, that like we bring into our craft that we're not incentivized to really talk about. And I think if we started blowing that up a little more, I think it'd be easier to identify what sort of researcher every person might be able to become with some attention and intention.
So I want to bring up the generalist thing. So I've been on record for calling generalists full stack researchers. And I totally get the desire and need for specialists, absolutely. When I first started at Lyft, I talked about hiring full stack researchers or generalists because in order to grow the team and answer the questions from our various product teams, I think one person covering an entire product area in sort of this service/embedded model, they weren't going to be able to answer just only specific questions. Like they needed to have sort of a breadth of methods under their belt to be able to know which one to, how to answer this question and be able to apply that methodology. But most of them weren't, pros in every single one of those methodologies. Like maybe they had one specialty and they were more T-shaped. So I'm curious to, just hear from you all, like what do you think about, like, I guess it sort of depends also on how you define UX researcher or generalist, UX research generalist or full stack researcher. And for me, it's really just, having several methods under your belts, like experience with them, having knowledge about them, versus say like, a survey scientist who is really focused on specialized surveys and their skill set there.
Shall I go?
I'm so on the fence in this debate. I can see the merits to either side of it, I don't know. It's hard for me to believe though that there are probably some core attributes that any person needs, right, to be effective at the job and to be good at the job. And so, but barring that obvious statement, like I can see the argument that Sekai makes that, like, yeah, you invest 40 hours of work into understanding the foundation, the fundamentals of doing this craft well. You can know enough to be dangerous, right? I remember when we had our conversation in the UX Quest conversation, Noam, you had asked me about the importance of survey knowledge, and I said something to the effect of that, it's my belief that you can know 20% of what there is to know about surveys and deliver 85% of the value that a PhD in survey sciences would deliver. I think there's probably something similar to be said on the qualitative front. But this is one of those interesting things. We're still figuring all this stuff out as a field, right? It's going to be interesting to see how this develops over the next couple of years.
I think it's important to hold like a position of no offense as researchers and designers figure out who they are in this moment of time in organizations. So if someone describes themselves as an expert or a generalist or mixed methods, I think my position is just to give people the space to figure out who they are as a researcher. And, those in hiring, it's not useful how people describe themselves as researchers. It's just simply not. Like experts don't call themselves experts because they haven't been appropriately like validated or supported in the community. It's just people who call themselves experts or shit. So it's really not useful. I just try not to be offended by how people talk about who they want to be. I try to listen because the way people are talking about their work, like using the term full stack is reactive to engineering, right? So like I take that as a signal, but try not to care.
Why do you think it's reactive to engineering?
In that it models it. Like full stack engineer, full stack researcher. I don't know that researchers would be calling themselves full stack researchers, but for the fact that they likely work with engineers who call themselves full stack engineers.
I've heard of designers calling themselves full stack designers too.
I think that's also reactive though. Which like, so I think it's reactive. I haven't thought much about like whether it's in fact reactive, but yeah, researchers and designers, I think, are responding to the power that engineering organizations typically have in the product development cycle. So just in terms of like when researchers started using that term, like I think within the last 5 years. And I think that's a function of how research has been treated in engineering organizations. That's just the hypothesis, but I don't know.
I'm going to turn my camera off for 1 second while I make this situation more full of light. I'm demonstrating my amazing abilities to forecast the future by forgetting that the sun would set at some point.
So while while Matt tries to look better, good luck with that, Matt. It's going to be a tough mission. I would love for us to maybe give some shout outs to a few more talks, more speakers, talk about a few more things. Whatever kind of tickled your fancy at the conference. I would love to give a shout out to Sarah Whitman, who's director of design at research at RBC. She talked about the replication crisis. And why we should care and what we can do about it. The replication crisis was and still is a huge deal in the realm of psychology, which is why this really resonated with me. And what it is, in a few words, is that a few years ago, we discovered within the realm of psychology that many of the classic studies in psychology don't replicate. And that's because a bunch of questionable research practices and some other things, and underpowered studies, and only studying what's known as weird populations, Western, educated, industrial, and so forth. And Sarah brought up the point that we might have a replication crisis unbeknownst to us because we never tried to replicate our work. That to me was super interesting and super cool. And totally. And I applaud you for bringing this up, Sarah. It was awesome. One of the bubbles that were burst, by the way, that she mentions is the Marshmallow Test, which is so sad to me. Do you know the Marshmallow Test? YouTube, you give children a marshmallow and you tell them, if you wait for 2 minutes, I'll maybe give you another marshmallow, but just don't eat this marshmallow or whatever. And then there was this research that if children at the age of 5 or 6 waited to eat the marshmallow, then much later on, they would have higher SAT scores and they would be CEOs and all of these things. And then when people revisited these data, they found that when you control for a bunch of pretty obvious things like how these kids grew up and who their parents were and social economic status and all of these things, suddenly the effect of the Marshmallow Test disintegrates, disappears. Wow. I mean, this was a super cool talk. And I mean, are you concerned hearing this? Like, should we be conducting like internal replications? Should we be concerned that because we don't have the time, we work so iteratively, that maybe a lot of our research would look very different if we tried again?
I think absolutely. I think it's something that I think about a lot. I think it's something that everyone should have walked away knowing that. Like, I think what was really cool about the experience was that there were still across like the talks was that like there are some moments where you're like, fuck, I'm a good ass researcher. And then sometimes you heard something and you're like, shit, I
don't know anything. Yeah.
So like, I think that was like the brilliance in the programming that the UXR collective team brought to the table. And that was definitely one of those moments where I think everyone was like, yeah, there's a big vulnerability there.
Totally. And yeah, I also love the programming in that sense. And I feel like maybe, I don't know, especially this year, I feel like there were so many provocative talks where you were just like, oh, damn, you're calling me out. Like the one about personas are dead and your talk, Sekai, and Molly's talk, and, so many things. And I'm just like, wow, like I suck and I have so much work to do. But it was so inspirational in that sense. And yeah, Sarah that was a great point to bring up, especially as we try to be more scientific, as Molly had pointed out. That's something that we should be doing for the future. And replication is definitely a part of what makes studies scientific. And I when I heard her talk, Sarah's talk, I was like, oh my God, I had no idea that some of the studies that she quoted, like the marshmallow study and the power pose study, hadn't been replicated and, were flawed. And like, I was just like, oh, but it's true. It's like, if you're telling a good story, like that's what kind of spreads, and that's what gets like the PR and the press, and whether it's in the media or within your company or what, but it's not always right.
Yeah, I haven't seen Sarah's talk yet, but there's also, and maybe she touches on this, but there's another issue that's related for UX research, which is that, unlike in the world of academia, we're not doing these studies for knowledge's sake all the time, right? Like, we're not doing it just to build out a corpus of knowledge. We're doing it to inform a thing that needs to get built within a certain period of time. And sometimes some of what we learn is going to get incorporated into some decisions as part of that process, but sometimes not. So it's difficult to know the extent to which, if we're doing bad research that wouldn't replicate, the extent to which that is causing harm in the first place or leading teams astray. And also, I don't think many research teams out there do a good job of documenting their work in a fashion that can build a body of knowledge over time in a way that you would want to do as an academic discipline.
And by the way, another point that was discussed in another talk really brought up to me that another difference between academia and industry, which we in industry probably should catch up a bit, to say the least. I'm talking about the Research Foundation's talk from Alba Villamil about the ethical researcher's checklist. When I was in academia, I had my ethical researcher's checklist, and I was bound to that. And I had the IRB, the review board, examining my research for potential ethical issues. I have never encountered that since. I'm going to be honest. And I can imagine that maybe you haven't always encountered that, or that you don't, you or the teams you work with don't have an ethical, an ethics checklist. I mean, what are we doing? Why is this a new thing in 2020? This is crazy. And we should, I'm working from home and I don't have a printer, but I really should print out some of those checklists and start using them very, very soon. Why aren't we there yet? What are we doing? How did you feel about, if you saw that talk or just hearing about it now?
I thought it was brilliant. I thought that she brought up some really great points, and I love the grid that she had for, it was so practical, and it's like, yes, we should be using this for each of our studies to think about where we might be going wrong from an ethical standpoint. It's so important. And it's funny because making the switch like from academia, whether it was just undergrad or grad school or whatever, and going into business, it's almost like night and day, because if you've ever done like some kind of thesis in school, you spend months and years even working on this, and you are crossing every T and dotting every I. And like, there is absolutely no time to do that in the business world. And like Matt was saying, it's very much like, how do you take this, thing called research and then make it usable for business purposes without screwing up all the things that like you need to do to make it very good research. And having that empathy, building those relationships that Sekai, you had talked about as well in the processes, I think a lot of that gets lost too. So I feel like as a discipline, we really need to think about like, how do we do this well in a short amount of time? Like, what things do we really need to be able to take? And what is an appropriate amount of time to set the standard so that we can all take that back to our companies and be like, this is how we do it, and this is like the right way. Anything less than this is not going to fly.
Yeah. What other talk stood out to you? Anything else we haven't discussed that you'd like to reflect on?
I just want to give a shout out to Roy. I might butcher his name, Roy Opada Olende. He talked about the dysfunctions of a team of one, and that just so resonated with me because I've been a team of one at SoundCloud, I've been a team of one at Lyft, and he had, if you're a team of one, or even if you're not, he had so many great pieces of advice. I would definitely rewatch that or watch it if you haven't yet.
Yeah, he's terrific. I agree.
I'll have to go back and watch that. That was one of the ones I was really excited by because lots of really, really mature organizations are working with research teams of one, and there's a lot of dysfunction. And I'm so interested in seeing how he dug into it.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm not alone in thinking that I have a lot of time to carve out to take in a lot of amazing content over the next 30 days. And that's one of the incredible things about this conference being remote and these videos being available for that amount of time. Attending the conference was amazing remotely, but as a lot of people observed already, it's like very overwhelming. I mean, the UXRC folks did an amazing job putting this together for the first time, sort of on the fly. But the experience of like following the conversation, like choosing which talk to pay attention to when you have, you know, every other talk a click away, it was a lot. But yeah, it's exciting to be able to dig into all this stuff, and there's so many, including Roy's, that I really am looking forward to watching.
Leo, my own watch list, but I also have never been to a conference where the sponsors were all so appropriate and we're bringing resources to bear that we need right now. So like Enjoy was a wonderful sponsor. Look Back, an incredible sponsor with an incredible tool. Ethnio, like all of this, like just everything about the conference, from speaker to just recording remotely to sponsor, was a top tier. So.
And the ads were amazing. I actually wanted to watch the ads.
They were good. They were so good. Can I just say how guilty I feel for being the one who submitted the Slack ad that was giving everybody Slack anxiety? And everybody in all the channels, they're just like, oh my God, I have 100 people trying to message me right now. So apologies from the person who got permission to use that ad for Slack.
Leo Yakelis brought up the notion of a screenome, screenomics. I love that one.
I thought that
Matt, what's your screenome? If I take a screenshot of your phone every 5 seconds, what's going on in there, Matt?
It's embarrassing. It's like, yeah, right? That's not happening. But no, like that was a great talk because it was one of those. It was a different type of real talk. You know, it's like, hey, guess what? You know, the way you're doing research, that ain't how people are using products. Like it's just not. You know, we're talking about 19 seconds of attention here, and what are you doing with that? And how are you understanding that? I thought it was awesome.
I want to know if it captures all my tabs, because I have like 1 million tabs open and I'm constantly like crashing Chrome or having to restart my computer.
I want us to end soon, so I respect all of your time, but I want to ask you one more thing, each of you, before we wrap up here. We have a question from Vishal. How can we empower more young people to become successful researchers? Do you believe that there are barriers to entry in the field that may be contributing to a lack of diversity? I think that in this conference, we brought up as speakers and participants several crises, several major issues in our work, several major opportunities in our work. But one crisis I'm seeing and I'm hearing about all the time from people I speak with, including many people who attended this conference, is how hard it is right now as someone who is early in their career or trying to transition into their career to get into research. And so I would love to hear your take as seasoned researchers who have seen a lot, been at many companies, done a lot of research. How can we empower young people to become more successful? You know, obviously we're doing a bit of that right now just by getting together and you know, sharing a bit of knowledge and reflections. But what else can we do, and how do we solve what I genuinely believe is a very serious crisis in our field?
I guess I'll start.
Yeah.
I mean, great question, something that we all want very badly. And, you know, for me, I feel like people are still discovering UX research. They don't even know it exists as a discipline. I think that's starting to change. And I think I've seen more momentum behind, you know, like just the understanding that we exist in the last few years, especially. But I think some of that is just not even being aware of this super cool discipline. But yeah, I mean, I think it all starts from where you're coming from. And if that is like, you know, Sekai, I'm sure you have a lot to say about this, but, you know, kind of a place of privilege, like most of us as UX researchers are, like, how do you expand your circle and bring in more of those folks?
I said in my talk, and I believe still that, I think I said this in my talk, that the people who exist in our communities that exist with the greatest amount of marginalization bring the greatest amount of insight to research programs. And so as someone who hires a ton of researchers, I look for the margins, because I think the task of all technology organizations is to bring the margins into the centers. And I think that is true in how we hire. I think that when you work with me, I don't care that you have any degree. I care about the fact that in a conversation, I can figure out how you get from observation to insight. And if you can credibly do that and describe how you've done that, then there's a reasonable opportunity to be on my team. And so I just think, like, what are the things that we care about when we hire researchers? I think we care a little less about those things, certainly as it relates to the sort of traditional gatekeeping functions like school and years of experience. But I think as organizations, we have to get better about what it really means to be entry level. And even when we hire like entry level or junior researchers, we're typically asking for like some years of research. And I think we just have to stop doing that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a reluctance for researchers who want to train from the bottom up. And I think if that's you and you're a research leader, you need to get out of the way. You get out of the way, and that's somebody who cares about bringing the margins to the center in the room. Let them do the hiring. So,
yeah. I think that's great. I think one thing that we don't see a lot of in our field is a lot of formalized mentorship programs or a lot of associate programs that are formalized, and that's something that I think can be a huge. That's a framework that can make that transition in terms of like thinking about what those typical cues are that hiring managers look for to you know, shift perception along those lines, right? So I think as the space grows, I think as the industry grows, I think we're going to see more of that. And maybe that's something for Alec and Maggie to think about. I think UXRC is really well positioned to play a leadership role here, actually. Yeah, but don't disagree with anything that's been said.
Okay, let's end here, as hard as it is to do, because we could talk for a long time. I'd love to, first of all, thank you three, Matt, Monal, and Sekai, so much for joining me today. For everyone watching, first of all, thank you for everyone watching as well, for all of your questions. I will include things, all of the details for Matt, Monal, Sekai in the description in this YouTube video. in case you need to contact them or want to chat. Thank you so much for watching this. A special thanks from all of us to everyone, every single person at UXRC, for the honor and the privilege to be speakers at this incredible conference, to participate in it, to be part of this community. I know I speak for everyone when I say we really appreciate it. We appreciate your hard work. We appreciate the sponsors that made it happen, and everyone involved in that very, very hard work. And if you haven't yet and you're watching this, I encourage you to join UXRC, join the community, take part, add your voice to the voices that are already there. It's incredible, and it's also one of the best ways, I think, to get into research and to thrive in it. It's to join these communities. It's to find mentorship and guidance, have incredible experiences, and just learn a lot. So that's about it. I will be back very soon with more videos and things. And if you'd like to see those, you know where to find me. I'm right down there, or all over the Twitter and the LinkedIn and everything. We're sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions, but please email me if you have them, and I'll send them to everyone's way or try to answer them later. That's it. Good night, and be safe and healthy, and have a lovely week. Goodbye for now.
Bye, guys.